Welcome back to Presidents in Politics. I am one of your hosts, Professor Caleb S. McGee, joined by my fellow co-host, former Congressman Ross.
Good day.
Back after a little break, my wife and I introduced our first child into the world, and she is perfect in every way. So that's that grin you see on my face. Thank you very much. Thank you. But it's good to be back.
It's good to have you back.
And we're going to talk about John F. Kennedy, JFK, or as his friends called him, Jack.
Yep, Mr. Charisma.
Oh, my goodness, was he ever. This is a fun one to start back on. So no matter your politics, we can all sit around and say we maybe disagree with the politics of JFK, or we maybe disagree with the morality of JFK at times. But from just a pure leadership/charisma standpoint, there's been very few presidents like John F. Kennedy.
And not only that, he had a great upbringing.
He really did.
He was the second of 9
He's Irish.
children. He's Irish.
I mean, we gotta like
pure Irish as they come. Boston,
yes.
Very well-to-do family.
They called these the lace curtain Irish, by the way, is the
Yeah.
slang, because the shanty Irish, which is where my family comes from, poor Okeechobee, were like the lower blue-collar workers of the Irishmen, right? And then the lace curtain Irish, they were the wealthy Irish, but they were always looked down upon still because they were considered new money and pretentious still. And John F. Kennedy tells the story of his granddad when he first tries to break it rich, of seeing the signs in the window of Boston, no Irishmen need apply. So maybe in some ways JFK kind of carries his Irishness as a chip on his shoulder at first.
Well, I think so, and I think that the encouragement from his parents that school was important, that education was absolutely important.
He's a Harvard man.
And competition, you had to win.
He's one of, 9 kids?
One of 9 kids, the second of 9 kids.
Yes.
And he had a lot of childhood illnesses.
Chronically sick.
Not the smartest kid in school. He just kind of went along to get along.
Can we use the term street smart? He was street smart. He wasn't always book smart.
Correct. But he was able to, make his way. He loved journalism.
He did.
He loved to write.
He did.
He didn't care for much anything else other than women.
And sailing.
Sailing
and women. That's pretty Irish, isn't it? The sea and women. What was it said that the three W's, whiskey, women, and war, that defines Irish history?
Well, when he went to Choate for high school, and then went to Princeton for his first year, but he wasn't doing very well. And I ran across with this. His father wrote him a letter. And while he was there, because he wasn't doing well in school.
Okay.
And his father said this. He says, "If I didn't really feel you had the goods, I would be most charitable in my attitude towards your failings. I'm not expecting too much, and I will not be disappointed if you don't turn out to be a real genius. But I think you can be a really worthwhile citizen with good judgment and understanding."
That's a good common sense.
For all of you out there that are listening that have wondered about your own abilities, your own talents, and finding yourself just bogged down thinking you're not anything but mediocre, remember that, because that man who received that from his father became President of the United States and one of the most influential men of the 20th century.
And won a Purple Heart and a Distinguished Cross and a Pulitzer Prize.
Yes.
And, I mean, if you look at his accomplishments, and here's what's amazing. I love that you're going on this, and we've talked about this a lot. When you look at history, the people who were maybe not expected to become great became the greatest.
Yes.
And a lot of times the people who were expected to become great didn't really accomplish the fraction of those who maybe had lesser talents.
Yeah.
And here's one thing I've seen as a professor, I think you've probably seen as well. Sometimes those who are the most gifted never learn the work ethic that's required.
Absolutely, because they can't appreciate it.
Exactly.
They don't know what failure's like.
Exactly.
And if you don't experience failure, you'll never be able to appreciate success.
That is so good.
That is so important, because that's what molds you, gives you the foundation, and he makes you even better.
Yes.
And he's a prime example of that. I mean, here's a guy who gets out of college and he goes to war. He gets him and his older brother Joe, who's the star, the scholar, everything.
The better athlete, bigger.
Everything.
Yes.
And they both go into the Navy. Unfortunately, Joe was killed in a tragic air disaster. And at the time, his father was ambassador to Great Britain.
That's right.
And his father was trying to groom his older brother Joe to be a presidential candidate. And John then is in the Navy. He's commander of a patrol torpedo boat, PT-109.
PT-109, very famous.
Very famous. Gets sunk by a Japanese destroyer, and he saves the survivors.
That's right.
On an island. It's a great story, an incredible story.
He swims over 4 hours. Now, he's got a multitude of physical illnesses.
Yes.
Including a really messed up back that he got trying to play football at college. He's got multiple ruptured disc. He has an autoimmune disease. Addison's disease affects the adrenal glands. He's got all kinds of issues physically. He had mumps, measles, like every disease, scarlet fever, 106 fevers as a kid, like everything you could possibly have as a child, he had. He'll swim 4 hours in the South Pacific, and at one point he'll actually drag one of his companions by his teeth, grabbing his life jacket, get him on shore. He sees some of the local population, so he'll take a coconut, you know the story, and he carves a message to the Allied forces on the coconut. He tells the native population, get this to some Allied, and they'll come rescue us. I mean, just an amazing story of the heroicism. And I don't think we talked about this, but actually JFK, because of his injuries and his ailments, was actually immune to have combat. They want him just for a desk job. Yeah. He'll pull strings in order to see. He tries to see combat in War II. He goes for the Army at first, and they totally deny him. Like, we don't even want you in the service. You're so sickly. So because of his father's connections, they pull strings to kind of squeeze him in the Navy in a combat position. And really, he's really too injured to have the job. Correct. And I love that it's voluntary hardship, and that's why the onset. You and I were talking about this. He reminds me a lot of Teddy Roosevelt.
Very much so.
Teddy Roosevelt, just such bad childhood illnesses, right? He talks about almost dying of his asthma, his father walking around patting him on the back, the doctor's prescribing cigars at the age of 7, which just, I love that story. You can see like 7-year-old Teddy like smoking stogies, but nonetheless. And then you look at JFK and same thing, this young, kind of broken, physically always challenged guy, but he's like, I'm not going to let that define me. And he tries to overcome this. He swims twice a day. He works out. He strength trains. He tries to do everything he can to build his body back up despite the ailments. Yeah. And he does great things. And I love the story of JFK. It's a story of resilience.
Wonderful. And you know, and I think he becomes, because of this, he becomes impatient.
Yes.
He wants more out of life. And at age 29, he runs for the open congressional seat. And he gets elected to Congress, serves for 3 terms, and finds that it's just boring. So he decides to run.
Can you speak from experience on that?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting because he said that it was somewhere that it was stifling. All the rules were stifling, and there just wasn't enough attention being paid to getting things done. And so he runs against the incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, who's a senator from Massachusetts, and they say it was one of the most well-organized, well-articulated, well-executed campaigns ever.
That's good.
And he puts his brother, Bobby, in charge as campaign manager, and they win. And he goes to the Senate.
The Kennedys knew politics.
The Kennedys
knew politics.
I mean, when you look at that family and the depth and breadth of their involvement in the political arena, I mean, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Yes.
But also the tragedy of the family, which we'll get to. But
talk about the luck of the Irish. Can we use that term, or is that too maybe callous for what they went through? This family went through some serious tragedy. As you said, we'll talk about that. He is a sharp mind when he's in Harvard, because after he doesn't do well his first college experience, he goes to Harvard. He does decent at Harvard. He was known as a mischief maker. Yes. Almost got expelled from Harvard. But while he's there, he starts to apply himself, and he wrote his senior thesis on the appeasement of Munich. Yeah. Later it's published, I think it was published in the term Why England Slept. Yeah. And
they were not prepared for World War I.
They were not. And you have, of course, Neville Chamberlain, who tries to broker a deal with Hitler to basically give England away to avoid war, right? And I love how Kennedy comes in through this gifted mind. Maybe not, he's not a Jefferson or an Adams by any means with his brain, but he's a street smart Irish kid from Boston, right? Yeah. And he comes in and he writes this idea of how appeasement actually leads to war. And we deal with this in our class. I teach in this all the time. I'm teaching a class right now from 1970.
Today's world. Look at what we're doing today.
Absolutely. And we can't repeat the tragic mistake of appeasement. Right. Appeasement leads to Hitler's and Mussolini's and everything else, right? So we understand that. And Kennedy writes this thesis on the appeasement of Munich, and it's later Why England Slept, and it's well received. And they're like, wait a minute. This kid's not just, a good-looking guy. He's actually got a decent brain under there. Yeah. It's well received. It's later published, and it kind of begins to define his political stance. I think this explains the Cuban Missile Crisis. This explains the Berlin Crisis. This explains his dogged grip.
He knew that appeasement wasn't the policy. He wasn't sure how to approach it, and that's why I think he surrounded himself with people who did.
That's a good way to put it.
And he was able to, as a young man, take the advice of those that were more experienced and apply it.
Yes. He's good friends with Eisenhower.
Yeah, he is good friends with Eisenhower.
And they'll meet several times at Camp David. One of my favorite stories is that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Eisenhower comes to Camp David. They're walking together, and Kennedy looks at Eisenhower, and he said, no man will ever know, and I'm paraphrasing here, the stress of this job until they're in it.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower responded. It's so classic Eisenhower. Eisenhower responded, "Mr. President, with all due respect, I told you that 3 months ago." And I just love that. And you get this from political leadership. It's not to be envied.
No, it's not. And I think that's the gravity that really hits home to a lot of those in a leadership position and that they campaign for, that they think they can do all these things, and then all of a sudden the gravity of the seat really affects them. They have to represent everybody. They have to make some very difficult decisions. And it's one thing to campaign, it's another thing to govern. And when you're in as president, I can only imagine the weight of the position just on your shoulders of what to do and what not to do, even though you campaign one way or another. And I think that's good. Because I think it was good for Kennedy. He made some mistakes along the way, but he left a wonderful legacy. He grew up incredibly quick. Yes, and like you pointed out, when he was in the Senate and he was laid up after back surgery for 6 months, and he authors Profiles in Courage.
That's right.
It becomes a
great
surprise in history. It is a wonderful book. I read that many times as a kid, and in college. It's just solid about what made America so good.
It's American, if I can use the term, it's like probably a popular American exceptionalism, right?
Yes.
It's American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
It's really the theme of that book. And you see it through and through the life of Kennedy. But again, if we look at him like a Roosevelt, he was a guy who took voluntary hardship upon himself. He didn't have to go to war in War II, but he took that upon himself. And you kind of see that throughout his life, taking hard things upon himself. And it's one of the things that did make him grow up quickly. And he dies at, 46? Yeah, 46.
Yeah.
He's 46 when he dies. Think of all that he accomplished in 46 years.
Amazing, isn't it?
It is.
And when he was in the Senate and he was being courted as being the vice presidential candidate, what was it, Adlai Stevenson, I think?
I believe so.
And then, of course, that didn't work out, but he gave a wonderful concession speech, and that set him up. I mean, he was so charismatic and so dynamic that when he was, nominated, it was... He captivated a whole new generation.
Yeah.
The baby boomer generation
I agree.
just tied onto him. And interesting because when he ran for president, he runs against Richard Nixon, who was then vice president, and him and Nixon were friends.
That's right.
They got elected to Congress together.
Right.
They socialized together, everything. And when even though there was a tremendous amount of controversy over the counting of votes and whether they were valid votes, especially with Mayor Richard Daley in Chicago, and graveyard votes and that nature, Nixon as vice president and as presiding officer of the Electoral College doesn't protest, and in fact congratulates him.
And certifies.
Yeah, certifies the results and congratulates him as an incredible example of the peaceful transfer of power in this nation.
American civility.
Yes.
It's what we were founded upon.
Yes, and it works.
It has to keep working. It's the only thing that makes the system work.
I agree.
And I really like that. But he was such a charismatic guy, and I guess we can kind of move into the 1960 electoral campaign, right?
Yes.
And specifically, it's the very first time. It's the very first time there's televised debates.
Yeah, TV made him. Or he made TV.
And Kennedy worked it.
He worked it well.
He worked, and I show this in some of my classes. You can see, or I have them look it up. You can see the debates. And here's Nixon. He's haggard. He hasn't shaved.
Right. 5 o'clock shadow.
Yeah. And he's sitting there and he looks half dead. And then there's this like spry, charismatic Kennedy. But remember, nobody really has seen a TV debate yet. So we can't beat up on Nixon. It's the first time. What do you expect?
Exactly.
Up until this point, everything's been done on radio and stump speeches. So he's just sitting in the studio thinking it's radio. And they're recording every nuance of the countenance of his face, and people are sitting at home and they're watching Kennedy. And after that first televised debates, the polling numbers just vastly switch because Kennedy knew how to work the camera.
It was amazing. He was amazing. Interesting, though, one of the things that I saw is that because of his ailments, he was a chronic user of amphetamines.
And nicotine. He smoked cigars. He was trying to push his adrenaline back up.
And this was before we found, science produced the results of amphetamines and the adverse effects it has on the body, but that kept him very pumped up a lot.
Yes, it did.
And when you look at him, you go back to FDR. I mean, here was FDR who was paralyzed from the waist down, and nobody ever really saw it or they ever did anything about it. Here's another president who has serious chronic back condition and other illnesses, and yet he's able to perform incredibly well. And is tested right away.
Yes.
With the Cuban, the Bay of Pigs.
We got to tell the Bay of Pigs. We got to talk about the pigs.
Which was approved by
Eisenhower
in
That's right.
advance.
And Kennedy never liked the plan.
No,
at least that's the rumors.
Yes.
That they say that his presidential cabinet and himself, he didn't want the plan to go forward, but the CIA has trained anywhere, it depends what you read, 1,400 to 1,500 Cuban refugees. And for those of our listeners that don't know the story, they're going to drop them back off in Cuba to build a beachhead.
Yep.
And then the belief was, or at least the intel was that this would lead to a popular uprising, and many of the Cuban citizens would join this beachhead, and they would overthrow. This is what the CIA is telling them. They would overthrow the Cuban government, specifically Fidel Castro, and the domino theory, of course, would throw communism out, and Cuba's going to be free.
And we were supposed to give some air support.
This is the confusion, right?
Yeah.
Herein lies the issue. 1,400 to 1,500 refugees are dropped off in Cuba. We pull back.
Yeah.
Was it 25,000? I believe 25,000 troops surround them. They have an ocean at their back. Castro's very well-trained military to the front, and no one comes.
Yep. It's a slaughter. They take prisoners.
That's 1,100 prisoners, I believe.
Yeah.
They kill about 400 in a couple of days. 1,100 are taken ransom. Eventually, we get them back. What is it? We pay like $53 million, something of that nature. And it is an utter debacle. And it is a black eye in the international community.
Here you got a new president who's supposed to be a war hero.
Yes.
Who just absolutely bungled this mission. And now we've got communism 90 miles away from the coast of Florida.
Yeah. Key West is closer to Cuba than it is back to the mainland U.S.
Yeah.
And now it's sitting at our back door. And Russia, and this all ties, this is why I love history, it all ties together.
Yeah.
So now the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah, with Nikita Khrushchev.
He looks at Kennedy. Privileged kid from Harvard, young, kind of good looking, he thinks he's soft. So what are you going to do? You're going to exploit it. Let's build offensive nuclear military capabilities in Cuba, and then Florida and the whole southeast coast is a sitting duck.
Yep.
And he doesn't think Kennedy's got the
chutzpah.
The chutzpah, I like that. Or was it Johnny Cash, the gravel in your gut and the spit in your eye?
Yeah.
He doesn't have the gravel in his gut and the spit in his eye to stand against it, or so he thinks. And now we have the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
Yeah.
And I've watched it a few times. If you ever go back, and I'm sure you have to, and you watch the speech, what is October 20? Yeah, we're actually coming close to the anniversary, October 22nd, where Kennedy goes on TV, and he gives that famous speech that there's a line that's been drawn in the sand. And any vessel coming into Cuba that's carrying weapons for offensive nuclear capabilities will be stopped and seized. And if anything is launched out of Cuba, then it will be considered a direct act of war from the USSR. Gets on national television and says that, and then says, and if you do this, we will bring basically hell upon you.
Yeah. Which, again, goes back to your point that appeasement was not the policy that he wanted to pursue. And when he failed at the Bay of Pigs, he relied on the right people to give him the confidence to come forward and call Khrushchev's bluff. And they did, and they backed down.
Yeah, and they start moving the ships, and there's the blockade that's made. And it's said, and I think it's really true, the eyes of the world were upon the Caribbean Sea. What is going to happen?
Well, I remember as a kid, because I was a very young kid.
Very young.
I was very young. very young. About like your daughter. And
10 days old.
Yeah. But I remember there was always the civil defense shelters, the bomb threat drills, in kindergarten and things of that nature, because Cuba was right there, and it was a communist country. Still is. Still there. Still same threat, but not as bad. And that established him. It gave him credibility. He went to Berlin. Khrushchev puts up the Berlin Wall.
That's right.
And he makes that, and Kennedy goes there to Berlin on the wall and makes that famous speech, Ich bin ein Berliner. Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner too. It was, and to let the world know that we all empathize or sympathize with what's going on.
Your German's much better than mine, by the way. Just so you know, it's much better than mine. My Okeechobee accent with that would have sounded a million times worse.
But I mean, at that point, he's on a roll. He's really starting. Unfortunately, his legacy of the Vietnam War, he
the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. That's something I guess we should probably hit.
He puts the military advisors,
advisors
in Vietnam, which we all know how that turns out, which isn't good. But he also it took some prodding, and it took some prodding from his brother, Bobby, who was the Attorney General. At the time he was president, took some prodding to get him engaged in the civil rights movement. Because the South, the leadership in the South were not for a civil rights act. They weren't for, and he finally sends troops to Mississippi.
That's right.
Under the recommendation of his brother Bobby.
That's right.
And makes all the difference.
Yeah, he's a quandary at time with his dealing of racial matters because he's very slow, but he seems to have a heart to see people reconcile because he's actually the very first president who will dance with an African-American woman at his inaugural ball, showing that he's got this heart of like unity and things of that nature, but then he's slow to act at times.
Yes.
So you wonder how much is politicized where he's afraid of losing votes in the South, specifically because if we think about this, he's the very first Catholic president ever voted in, very, very first, and almost lost the election solely from being Catholic. And one of the turning points, of course, was he goes to the Houston. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. It's a meeting of Protestant ministers there in Texas, and I wrote this down. And he goes and he speaks before them in what the Greater Houston Ministers Association. And while he's there, one of the biggest concerns at this time was, because of ancient history, basically was when the Pope speaks as God. So if the Pope spoke as God, then the president would have to listen. Therefore, the logic would be Pope's president, right? Yeah. And this is what his detractors were all saying is you can't vote in Kennedy because if you vote in Kennedy, you're going to just vote the Pope in, right?
Right.
So this is the belief. And then Kennedy's one of the very first Catholics who stands up in front of all these Protestants and he says, by the way, when I'm the president, I put on the president hat, and I'm not Catholic. I don't listen to the Pope anymore. I'm just the president. And then in my own personal life, I put on my Catholic hat. Yeah. So he makes this almost schizophrenic nature of the presidential office, that the presidential office itself is its own entity, that you put on the role, which is an interest. I kind of like that.
I think it's
you put on the role of president. And this is the reason why some presidents...
It's what you do. It's not who you are.
That's good. And this is why some presidents even refer to themselves as Mr. President. It's almost like you're becoming that person,
right,
and then you're taking it off as your individual inclinations. Right?
Yes.
And he made the really famous statement that if we don't vote someone in because they're Catholic, he said, then 40 million Americans lost the right to be president on the day they were baptized in the Catholic Church.
Wow, that's powerful.
He's a great orator. It's that Irish blood coming out. We're storytellers.
And you got to, hey, what's the famous statement, at his inauguration? Ask not what your country can do for you. Rather ask what you could do for your country.
Absolutely.
And that is that's so true today.
Yes.
He created by executive order the Peace Corps, which was so important and still exists today. This guy was just very captivating to his generation. And of course, what happens at Dealey Plaza in Dallas. But, he marries this wonderful woman. Jackie O. Tragically, they lose 2 children, at childbirth. Carolyn is born, John is born, and then, of course, back, in 1998, I guess it was, John dies in the plane crash.
That's right.
There's a lot of tragedy in the family.
A lot of tragedy. And Jackie O is a brilliant mind in her own right. She works as a journalist before they're married. In fact, I wrote this down because it was interesting. Her first title in journalism was Inquiring Camera Girl. It's an interesting title, but she was a gifted photographer. She was a gifted writer. She'll, of course, help him write his memoirs. Later, after Kennedy dies, she will get remarried. She'll marry a Greek shipping magnate. And then she'll also become a book editor for about 2 decades. So she's a very bright, driven woman in her own mind. She remodels the White House. And she spends a lot of time painstakingly refurbishing the furniture from the original eras, trying to make the White House historically accurate again. So she is an asset to Kennedy.
Very much so.
In so many ways.
And I think she's the one that coins the term Camelot.
Yes. So a little over 1,000 days he's in office, and it's called the Camelot of America. They are, if we can really use the term, they're the only royal family we've ever had in America. He's young, he's good looking. Jackie O's beautiful and stunning. They have these young kids in the White House playing in the Oval Office. They're like the royal family of America at this time. Like everyone loves to see the pictures of little Junior John playing it like on the knee of his dad, pushing cars in the Oval Office, and he's signing over here, with a cigar. It's like it's as American as it gets, right? It doesn't get any more Norman Rockwell than that, right? It's just it's straight up Norman Rockwell America. The pictures of them around the Christmas tree and his pipe and the kid, it's just what it is. And America loves them. They love the Kennedy family.
They do.
And a lot of the alleged scandal is kept out of the public eye at this time.
But it's interesting because his policies are not what we consider today to be very liberal.
No, they're not radical at all.
No, in fact, he promotes and actually gets passed tax cuts.
Yeah. He's a pretty middle-of-the-road guy.
Yeah, he raises the minimum wage.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like...
He's a Teddy Roosevelt again. He's he's pro-military, he's pro-tax cut, he's pro-business, but he's still pro-union. He's just kind of a middle-of-the-road, kind of common sense guy.
And he also was, after what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he promotes and gets successfully passed the Test Ban Treaty.
That's right.
Nuclear Test Ban
That's
Treaty,
right.
which was very important at that time. And I think that he was very much in tune with what was going on. And you can only imagine what the world would have been like had he not been assassinated and had a second term.
That's good.
He goes in and says...
Especially if we not had an LBJ term.
Well, yeah. That's
a different podcast, but if we could push an LBJ term...
But think about it. Sputnik goes around the Earth. We're nervous as ever. The United States is nervous as ever. And he picks that as a challenge and says, we'll accept it.
The space race.
The space race begins. And he says, by the end of this decade, we will put a man on the moon.
Yes.
And it's like, wow.
And what's interesting to me, if we're to talk about...
and he did.
Yes. And if we can talk things that unify maybe across parties, space was one of them, because like the two greatest space advocates are Kennedy and Reagan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just think from a historical standpoint. Those are your two biggest space advocates are Kennedy and Reagan, and policy-wise, are pretty diverse.
Yeah.
And that's just one of the things I like. I don't think in modern America, we don't have a lot of shared interests across the aisle anymore. And I think it's one thing that would really help us if we could find some common ground and we could go, okay, we can be unified on this. And the space race was one of those things that we were unified on, no matter your political leanings.
Absolutely.
And I don't really know what the last big unifying thing was in America. Maybe the Twin Towers. Yeah, I was going to say that's about the only thing I can think of. We need a unifying thing. Hopefully not to that magnitude by any means. But we need a unifying thing in America again. That no matter,
it's frightening what's going on now.
Yes,
absolutely frightening.
I could not agree more. I love that you bring up the space race because Kennedy was a visionary.
And again, he knew what we could do. He wasn't sure how to get there.
Yes,
but he knew how to employ the right people to get it done.
And he's the youngest president ever elected, not served, because of course Roosevelt's younger. Yeah. Because he comes in because of assassination of McKinley, of course. Which, by the way, maybe that youth is what made their presidency similar.
Yeah.
I guess we could say that.
Yeah, the one was 43, the other one was 42.
So. Yes. So JFK's 43 when he comes to office, and this really defines his presidency in a lot of ways. That youth and that vigor, and like you said, it captures the baby boomer vote.
Yeah.
It captures the baby boomer vote. So I guess we have to talk about his assassination. Right, the assassination is what he's probably most well remembered for in younger generations. He's in Dallas, Texas. You just got back from Dallas, Texas.
Yeah.
He's riding with the governor and his wife, John Conley. It's a convertible. Mm-hmm. I always tell my students, if you ever go into politics, never ride in a convertible. That's always my running thing with them because it never ends well.
You're right.
Right? So he's riding in a convertible in Dallas, Texas. The famous last words, Conley is in the front seat, and he turns around to look at Kennedy, and he makes this statement, Mr. President, you cannot debate that Dallas loves you. Mm. Shots ring out. Well, shot.
Yes.
Shot or shot.
Yeah.
Ring out. And the president is dead.
Yeah.
And the images are so graphic because it is,
and that Zapruder film that captures,
yes,
just everything. It's frightening.
When you look at there's the really famous picture where Jackie is reaching over on the trunk, and literally what she's trying to pick up is like pieces of Kennedy's head. It's such a tragic thing. And then, of course, and we're getting ahead of ourselves, but when Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn into office, she refuses to change clothes.
Yeah, so she's standing there with her dress and blood on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Lyndon B. Johnson, allegedly, again, rumor says that he requested for her to change. And she's like, no, this is not a happy occasion. This isn't your coronation. We're going to let the people remember why you're here. And she stands there in her bloody dress. And
they weren't friends. They were not friends. Neither her nor him. I mean, Lyndon Johnson did not get along with Kennedy.
And Kennedy never trusted him.
No, but he needed Texas in order to win the presidency. Mm-hmm. And this whole thing, I mean, this is why the whole conspiracy theory.
There's so many conspiracies.
Oh, my gosh. And then of course, Lee Harvey Oswald gets killed by Jack Ruby.
And they're all pronounced dead at the same hospital, at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, very close together. Mm-hmm. It's a mess. And you had the 1979 House Select Committee on Assassinations. Mm-hmm. They reviewed this, and if I'm not mistaken, they actually say, there likely is something else going on here. The FBI comes out and starts arguing, that's not the case at all. The whole thing's a mess. Did you see this when you were in Congress, seeing these transcripts?
No, but actually in 2017, I think Donald Trump released, because there was a 25-year hold on it, and in 2017, I think he released it all but about, 100 and some pages, which were still being held back. I don't know if those have ever been released, but I did not. I didn't take the interest in it at the time. because I felt it was just more and more rabbit trails. You just don't know. You just, you accept and move on. Is the
You
way
don't
I
want to
look
end
at
up
it.
in that guy with aluminum foil on your head.
Yeah,
Sitting in the corner.
Yeah.
Because there are some absolutely crazy things that happen. So for our listeners that don't know, like you said, Lee Harvey Oswald is charged with a murder. He is the shooter who shoots Kennedy. And then while he's being arraigned, Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner, steps up in front of the camera and dispatches, shoots Lee Harvey Oswald. Then he's arrested, and then he dies while he's in custody. And allegedly, he's asking to be transferred somewhere. The whole thing is just really messy. We know Lee Harvey Oswald had spent some time in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
We know that he apparently had become a fan of communism.
Yeah.
Again, it's all messy. We don't know. There's
If only we had social media back then.
Then we would know the truth.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if it's on the internet, and specifically social media,
then you know it's true.
we know it's true. I don't really know what else to say about his assassination without just getting off into rabbit trails.
No, and if you've ever been to Arlington National Cemetery and you see his gravesite next to his brother's Bobby's, it's very compelling. I mean, here was somebody just really taken down in his prime.
Yes.
And Kennedy offered so much hope
I like that.
through his charisma. And I think that engaged a generation to even say, despite him getting us into Vietnam, it's that next generation that used that charisma to protest. And it changed the 60s. We'll see as we go along in the next few podcasts, but the 60s changed the course of this nation dramatically. And he was at the forefront of that.
Yeah, the 60s and 70s are one of the weirdest times in America. I always tell my students that when we come to that.
Yeah.
It's one of the weirdest times in American history. Now, it produced some really good rock and roll. But other than that, it is one of the weirdest times in American history. It really is. You know?
It is.
And I guess sometimes, and we always said this in class, some of that that dissident nature of rock and roll came from that. It was a reflection, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's why Vietnam's called the Rock and Roll War, actually. But it was just, it's an interesting, and like you said, we'll get into this a little bit more when we come to Lyndon B. Johnson, who...
Yeah, that'll be an interesting one.
That'll be an interesting one. Let me just give one of Kennedy's quotes. So I like this as we kind of put a bow on this thing,
Yes,
right?
sir.
I feel like we're kind of wrapping this up in a strange way. But Kennedy made this quote. I really like this. It should be clear by now that a nation can be no stronger abroad than she is at home.
Amen. Amen.
I don't think it's more poignant for where we are.
I agree with you.
We look at our foreign policies and some of the struggles that were happening, and if we're being honest, I think a lot of those roots are at home. We're never going to be strong abroad until we're strong at home first.
Amen.
Kennedy understood this, and I think that his foreign policies were nothing more than a reflection of his domestic policies.
Yes.
And I think we need to remember that.
Great president.
Great. Again, the good versus great?
Yes.
Not necessarily a good guy, ethically speaking. But he was a great man in so many ways, and I think he really he defined a generation.
Yeah, he really did.
He defined a generation.
He sure did.
And going from Kennedy to Lyndon B. Johnson is...
Yeah, it'll take us right into the heart of the turmoil of the 60s.
Yeah, so stay tuned for next week.
You got it. Thank you.